I'm very excited to talk about this project, which is joined with Marius Günzel at Wharton and Clint Hamilton, a PhD student here at Berkeley. All right, so the motivation for this paper comes from kind of seeing this discrepancy in how we in economics think about hiring and firing and how managers talk about it. It's easy to find quotes like the one above, where managers torture themselves about how hard it has been to let people go. Pretty much any documentary or oral history, biography you can read about a top manager, they talk about how that was a really scarring experience when they went through a crisis and had to let people go. In fact, there's even academic data documenting it. For example, the Martin 2005 and Haddock 2005 papers, which surveys a large number of senior executives who describe hiring and firing as the toughest decision, gut-wrenching, human decision that took a heavy toll on them. In economics, instead, the typical discussion, hiring and firing, might be along those lines. As a manager, I'm trying to maximize profit with inputs, capital, and human capital, and it's human capital. And I'm maximizing that, given my budget constraint, given the expenses for wages and for capital. Now, of course, that's not where labor economics has stopped. We are aware that there are classical adjustment costs. For example, think about job advertising, hiring, labor market policies, severance pay, layoff notices, etc. But to me, the quote on the previous slide sounds as if there's a different type of cost going on as well. So what we propose here is, let's call it behavioral adjustment cost, which we will link to the empathy literature in neuroscience and social psychology. And today I'll present some results, both from a static perspective, basically thinking about the level effects of empathy on layoffs, and a dynamic perspective of how managers might get more attached to their firm over time, which might deepen their social concerns and hence alter the human resources decision-making. Of course, while I'm proud of the new data and new evidence and we are bringing here to the table, we will have to wrestle with a broad range of more standard explanation, such as norms or implicit contracts. There might be social pressure from unions, local government, media. I might act as if I'm reluctant to fire, but I'm not really deep down. There are social image concerns or mere fear of lawsuit and complaints. And I'm going to contrast that with our proposed interpretation, what we're calling prosociality in the title, which is again in the spirit of the empathy literature, which says that others' emotional state affects you. And the bigger the self-other overlap it is, the more you see yourself in others, the stronger that effect should be. Here's the overview to make sure you know what we have in the paper if I don't get through everything in my 45 minutes. As I mentioned, we bring a unique new data set on layoffs to the table, where we employed a natural language processing to identify layoffs, in contrast to what has been done before, which is basically just looking at net employment changes, which tends to confound, voluntary separations, retirement, etc. And then we have 6 sets of results. The last one, a little more preliminary still. First, we document significant health costs of layoff decisions for the CEO. So when in response to industry distress, I have to fire somebody, I'm aging faster and I'm dying earlier. And that is really important to address a lot of the alternative explanations. And then how do the layoff decisions look like? We document that the frictions in layoffs increase over time, over a CEO's tenure. So following plausibly exogenous CEO changes, they go up. They decline then within the tenure, and CEOs who have been an internal promotion, have been with the company for a while, are particularly reluctant. These effects are amplified for layoffs that are more painful for the employees. I'm going to look at times of recessions when it's hard to find an alternative job. I'm also going to look at the holiday season around Christmas, or here in the US, Thanksgiving. They are also amplified when it's more painful to witness for the CEO. So if it's geographically close employees, it's at the location where your headquarters is. There's some prior evidence on that. So we link that to the increase over time, which we document here. And we add to that socially close employees. Finally, what do these long tenured, more prosocial CEOs do when they don't fire employees, even if the neoclassical model says they should? Well, they have to cut costs somewhere else. We show that seems seems to happen in investment, particularly R&D. And then we also have a first step towards kind of really teasing out that it's the empathy channel using a proxy that relates to a prior overconfidence literature. All right. So here's the simple conceptual framework again. So think about on top in the classical model a standard decision making where CEO hires employees in period 1 and period 2 and 1 and 2 and decides how much capital to invest. That's K1, K2. And so makes his choices in the current period 1, let's say, to maximize profit and then expected profit the period after, subject to some sort of financing constraint. Now, in the behavioral model, what we're adding here is that there's a component of, well, the fact that these are humans affecting you in your decision making. That's what we're kind of trying to capture in this last term here on the right. So what is that F of S2? Well, S is the state the worker is in. It can be either employed or unemployed, and utility of the worker is higher if they are still employed rather than when they are fired and have been unemployed. Now, this utility we allow to affect the CEO. So if the worker I ends up being unemployed, then this difference in utility between unemployed and employed can affect the CEO. And that's this alpha, this key parameter here, alpha to I. So we actually allow it to vary by employee. And if that is not 0, then the CEO feels some prosociality towards the employee when it's positive. So disutility affects the CEO negatively. So but what happens if you just build this simple friction into the classical model? What this immediately generates is that there is a possible divergence in hiring and firing decisions between classical CEOs and behavioral CEOs. So if liquid assets, if liquidity is really high, so this cash flow C2, the CEO needs to fund this decision making, then it's all the same. Like the classical or standard CEO and prosocial CEO, the same hiring, they have the same profits, and they have the same utility also in the second period. Now, I should say, let's just assume, just for the illustration here, in the first period, they hire the same amount of people, and one is the same, just for my graphs. You don't need it in the model. Okay, so but then also in the second period is all the same. If the firm is doing great, everybody keeps all the CEO, employees or hires some more. You see it here. If period 2 cash on hand or cash flow is high, then prosocial and standard CEOs do the same. The first discrepancy comes in an intermediate realm where C2 is not quite as high. At this point, a neoclassical CEO might say, okay, we're not having as much demand. I don't need as many wedges being produced. I can fire some people. And the prosocial CEO who feels the disutility of their worker is reluctant to do that. So we're in the area of layoff avoidance. The prosocial CEO will keep all the N1 workers from the previous period, while the neoclassical CEO will fire some people. As a result, that neoclassical CEO will have higher profits than the prosocial CEO, but the prosocial CEO is still happy about what they're doing. Their utility from not firing people is still higher compared to if they were firing people, getting more profits, but feeling the disutility of all that workforce they have let go. So this is the area where the prosocial CEO keeps employment flat. Sorry, I should have said on the y-axis is, changes in labor demand. So doesn't fire or hire anybody, change is 0, while the standard CEO says, nope, things are not going so well, I'm letting some people go. Finally, a last region to the very left is really low realization of cash flow. In this case, even the prosocial CEO sees they have to let some people go, N2 is smaller than N1, but they still don't want to let quite as many people go. So as a result, their the prosocial CEO's profits are still lower than that of the standard CEO, but the prosocial CEO is happy to do that, gets higher utility. And you can actually even, so you can illustrate here, you see some kind of firing going on even for the prosocial CEO, but they stay always above the number of employees the neoclassical CEO has. So to dig a little bit deeper into the mechanism, basically the prosocial CEO goes as far in firing as they can, such that the marginal profit of an additional layoff equals the disutility cost. That is still better for that prosocial CEO than if they did the standard choice and let more people go. How do they deal with that? Even in the model, you can show, well, they have to get the money to pay all these workers they keep employed from somewhere. So we will observe underinvestment. Okay, so this generates a couple of hypotheses, which we will test. First, there's a direct disutility from making layoffs, right? So the prosocial CEO's utility when they have to reduce and to compared to N1 is smaller than that of the standard CEO. So that's what I'm going to link to stress and health costs. Second, a new CEO who just faces people for the first time, hasn't formed any attachment yet, is more likely to let people go. So that's this extensive margin difference. There's neoclassical CEO always lays off people, but if I'm prosocial, when I come into the firm, I haven't formed the attachment yet. That's the easiest time for me to let people go. So you can also consider now, not that I can really test that, but as a prediction in terms of higher, lower disutility as CEO gets, you can also say, well, the higher the prosociality of the CEOs, as I go from the dark blue line here to the lighter blue line here, the more these curves get left shifted, meaning the fewer people they let go. Now, again, I can't measure exactly that in the data, although if you guys have suggestions, right, this, you're my audience, we have the highest hope for suggestions, how I can get variation in employee relevant prosociality. I would love to test it. For now, what we're doing here in these hypothesis 3 and 4, we consider these variations in how painful a layoff is, both for the employee and for the CEO. So for the employee, as I said before, a stronger negative effect might, for example, be proxied by, I let you go around the holiday season and, you don't spend quite as nice of a Christmas with your family, or during a recession when it's much harder for you to find a new job. For the CEO, given that I can't measure directly, these are more prosocial types or less prosocial types, I can, however, exploit this variation in social closeness, geographic closeness, which proxies for being more attached to an employee. So this utility from having to let them goes up. So we're going to test whether we see the effects increasing as workers are socially closer or geographically closer. And then finally, we're also going to look at the reduction in capital and the correlation with empathy proxy based on prior overconfidence literature. Just super briefly, my 45 minutes, I don't have a lot of time to discuss in more detail the alternative explanations, which we spend a lot of time on. As I mentioned, you can think about CEOs not letting people go just out of career concerns because you look like an unsuccessful guy if you had to fire a lot of people. I can also see the opposite, but I'm obviously playing devil's advocate here. Social norms, there's an implicit contract when you enter a firm that you don't do this thing of like hiring and firing, having this type of corporate culture, social pressure, social image. I mean, all sorts of explanations, it's not that the CEO is really affected by whether or not he's hiring, firing a human versus buying and selling a machine, right? That's what the standard model says. It only looks like this. In reality, the additional ingredient is social pressure, social image, social norms, but the CEO couldn't care less. And as I said, the fact that we're going to document, I'll show you in a second, personal cost of firing, I think makes it really hard to pursue these alternatives. Also, the fact that people who are socially closer to me, so CEO, typically a white-collar guy, has a harder time letting white-collar people like him typically go, I think is also harder to reconcile with some of the traditional frictions that have been proposed. So instead, we are being a little bit more unusual in our hypothesis and say that we think that the effective experience of these other people, the one who are potentially firing, their actual inferred emotional state affects you, even if you are a CEO, even if you're a manager. That has an impact on your decision making. And what we can leverage is that this is not something that not only something that has been measured in your brain, how things light up when you see another person suffer or have joy in a kind of mirroring way. It has also been documented that this effect is stronger the stronger the self-other overlap, so friends versus strangers, which means it's not necessarily that my empathy is largest for the people who generally suffer the most from a firing decision, but people who are similar to me. So this empathy literature gives us a couple of heterogeneous and time-varying predictions, which we can go out and test in the data. What's the data? We assembled a comprehensive new layoff data set of layoff announcements. So we go to the capital IQ key developments data and go to that flag for discontinued operations and downsizing, and kind of download all that text which they've put together from various newspaper announcements submitted to the SEC. Then we use NLP to identify lemmatized layoff words, such as cut, or people words, such as employee. So for example, when it says Advanced Micro Devices Incorporated has cut 215 jobs in Austin as part of a larger cost-cutting effort, we lemmatize as cut to have cut, identify jobs, also grab the number 215. And by the way, we also grab the location. So size and location shown in green here are taken as well. Now, with all this nice natural language processing, we still didn't necessarily trust this would all go well. So we actually hand reviewed each entry with some detailed instructions. That was actually helpful in a few really complex cases where there was maybe layoffs that were truly involuntary versus employee reassignment to another location, which maybe the employee isn't also quite happy about, but probably doesn't have the negative emotional impact in the same way as letting people go. Also, the usual problem the labor literature has dealt with: voluntary departures, early retirement, etc. Just to show that I think there's some value in what we're doing over the proxies which have been used so far. If I just use the CompuStat change in net employment plotted here, and then I group based on my layoffs data, the sample into those where there were no layoffs, small layoffs, medium layoffs, large layoffs. It's comforting to see that it goes in the right direction, right? The larger the layoffs, the more negative the net employment change. But there is still a wide distribution, including, no layoffs, significant fraction that looks like people have been let go, small layoffs, and medium layoffs, maybe not quite as dissimilar as you wish, given that we are actually terciling the layoffs here. So I think we are producing a useful new data set also for future research. And then merge that with some standard ExecuteComp, CompuStat databases. We got data on exogenous CEO turnover on the Gentry et al. Team, and we collected historical CEO birth and death data, which we partly used in a prior paper, but also needed earlier data, which Hallock and kindly provided us with. Here's the sample statistic. So for our main data set, this layoff sample, we have almost 35,000 observations. If I define a layoff as an indicator that's equal to 1 if the firm cuts at least 1% of employees in a given year, or if it's not 1% in a given cut, they have at least 3 layoff events. So if I use that dummy, which is kind of trying to get at a somewhat significant layoff, then the sample statistics look as follow. In 13% of my firm years, I have a layoff. I can make this sharp. I can make this more conservative. I can, for example, go to 5%. Then the number goes somewhat down. The results are exactly the same. And I can impose no restriction, and we still generate all the results I show you today. So that is pretty comforting. Typical CEO has been tenured for more than 8 years, but there's a wide range. So if you look at the interquartile range, going from 3 years to 11 years, so we have some variation in tenure to play with here. Again, there is an older mortality sample, which comes from Hallock. Here, the mean CEO appointment year is in 1980s instead of in the 2000s, and the CEOs are significantly older. So they're 43 at appointment and above 80 years at death, which we observe in the data. Also when they're not CEO anymore, I should clarify. Okay, let me show you what we do with this data. And for that, I'm going to just step back for just a second to an older paper, which some of you have seen before on CEO stress, health, and death, with Marius Borgschulte, also with Mark Borgschulte, also Marius Günzel, and Sanyao Liu, which documented a link not between layoffs, but just industry distress shocks and CEO health outcomes. And what we did in this paper is we looked, we got pictures of CEOs before and after they went through an industry distress shock. So here you have James Donald of Starbucks, just before the financial crisis, and then 6 years later after the financial crisis. And a lot of people say, well, he looks actually as if he didn't age by 6 years, but 10 or 15 years. So this is what visual machine learning programs do. You give them a picture and they kind of identify your so-called apparent age. Oh, sorry, it's not 6.4 years, it's 4.4 years. But I kept the difference the same. And so the difference between the first and the second year is 4.4 years in actual time, and people estimate it to be the guy has aged by 7 or 10 years. So in this previous paper, what we did is we got pictures of all CEOs in the Forbes 500 and then used convolutional neural network to kind of, feed in pictures, 224 times 224 times 3, red, green, blue, pixel values to feed it in. The program would go over it, transform the input by sliding over or convolving convolutional neural networks and detecting patterns such as edges or corners and spitting out a vector of probabilities, whether the guy in the picture looks as if they are 0 years old, 1 year old, 2 years old, up to 99. And then you can form the expected value, and that's the age you assign to the picture. So again, this is apparent age. These programs are very good at documenting biological age, like how old you actually are. But those programs determine apparent age. That's the age your doctor writes down when you go to visit them. They know your biological age, but they notice whether you look as if you aged a lot, which is highly predictive of inflammation, cognitive decline, and earlier death, unfortunately. So that's what we did in this previous paper to kind of ask whether industry distress shocks make you age faster. If you're worried that some pictures are too smiley and others are more grim looking, maybe particularly in a crisis or when you have to let people go, we also used image manipulation. So for example, this guy here, Rex Tillerson, who was secretary under Trump's first administration, but also CEO of a big oil company in the US, he never smiled. And you can make him progressively more smiley with image manipulation and then rerun the analysis with all CEOs smiling in your analysis. It doesn't change anything. What you find is if you compare, say you take the financial crisis and you compare people whose company went through an industry distress shock before the crisis, then these pictures, they don't look significantly different in terms of age. So you take this apparent age minus biological age, you take the gap, and you compare people who will experience an industry distress shock, a crisis, firing, etc., versus those that don't, and you see there's no significant difference. Then the actual shock comes. So again, at this point, it wasn't a layoff analysis yet, just any industry distress shock where the stocks in your industry go down by at least 30%. And you see how people who are running a firm where that's happening age pretty much immediately by half a year, then it goes up to 3/4 of a year. And then it kind of settles in the long run, long after they're retired, around 1.2 years older. Now, the extra unfortunate thing is, I mean, not only do you look older, see all the wrinkles and so on of the stuff you've gone through, it translates 1-to-1 to mortality. So in this paper, we are taking this result as given, but we are basically asking, this was for any industry distress shock. We are particularly interested in layoffs. Is there a link between layoffs and mortality? In fact, controlling for industry distress, which we have shown to be significant before. And so I'm going to go directly to the CEO death outcome. So I'm asking, can I predict earlier death if you had to go with your company through a big layoff event? And I will distinguish between non-distress, kind of voluntary, the markets didn't force you, and distress layoffs, meaning layoffs that happen during an industry distress shock. And here are the key results. So whether you include industry and state fixed effects, or also year fixed effects, and of course we're always including controls for all sorts of firm characteristics, size, profitability is important. We play around with some extra profitability proxies, like how did your stock perform? What was the minimum performance over the last year, over the last 5 years? Whatever variant you choose, you always find that in predicting CEO death, putting in, of course, actual age, the older you are, the more likely you are to die. Putting in industry distress, which we know from our previous JF paper, significantly predicts death, and then putting in, did you have to go through a layoff event? The industry distress actually becomes insignificant. The same still holds if I put in all sorts of controls for how the firm is doing, stock performance, profitability controls. But what is significantly positive is a distress layoff. Your firm went through a major layoff event during times of distress. And it is not the distress in and of itself. It's really only happening. That's where we hadn't figured out in the previous paper when there is a layoff event. And the effect is large. So the distress layoff experience corresponds to an age effect on mortality of 1.85 years, meaning, you're basically aged by almost 2 years. You can do lots of, variations in terms of estimation using stratified Cox proportional hazards model, survival model controlling for CEO tenure with different layoff sizes, and the results are very robust. Now, okay, we have established CEOs suffer when they have to guide their firm through a big layoff event. Now, how reluctant, how resistant are they to letting people go? So let's start with what happens when a new CEO comes in. Here is a way to kind of show it in an event study methodology. I take CEOs, I take firms where there's a quasi-exogenous CEO turnover. That's again the previous data we got from these papers about in-office death or illness, which led to an unexpected turnover. So we have a quasi-exogenous CEO turnover. What is happening in terms of layoffs? Well, if I match that firm with the exogenous turnover with a control firm in the same industry, but who didn't have an exogenous CEO turnover, we see that 1 year pre-event or 2 to 3, 4 to 5, there's no significant differences in layoff propensity. In the year after, 2 years after, 3 years up to 4, 5 years after, you see that layoffs are significantly higher in the firms that had an exogenous turnover event. So meaning when a new CEO comes in, not yet attached to the firm, not yet attached to the employees, they apparently have a much easier time letting people go. And remember, this was for quasi-exogenous reasons. This was not one of these hires where the firm was in trouble and you hired somebody to get him out of it. So of course they need to let people go. No, that was a quasi-exogenous turnover. I should say though, if you want, you can also take the first year out and you still get significant differences. Now, conditional on the CEO having arrived, what happens over their tenure? So I'm just showing you here the bin scatter plots of layoff propensity on CEO tenure going from 0 to 25 years. What you see is that the propensity to let people go significantly declines, and that holds after you residualize. So you first regress both sides on all of these controls I mentioned on the previous slides when showing the table. The effect is large. So a one standard deviation effect leads to a decrease in almost 10% of layoff propensity out of a baseline layoff propensity of 13%. So not 9.4 percentage points percent, but it's still a significant measurable effect. Now, at this point, differently from the exogenous turnover we had earlier, and maybe also the aging results and the death results, you might start to wonder, well, but layoffs over CEO tenure, that is endogenous. CEOs who are successful, who stay for longer, maybe have to let fewer people go. And it is hard to find the perfect experiment for that. I do not have the perfect experiment for that. But what you can do is a slightly different analysis, for which we have an IV strategy, thanks to Joel Tonji and Shakotko's 1987 labor paper, which has also been used in finance by Graham and al. So what they do to get this exogenous element into the analysis is to say, we don't use actual tenure of a CEO, right? That might be correlated with all sorts of quality of managerial decision-making aspects. We use percentage of your tenure finished so far. So everybody starts at 0% of their tenure completed, and everybody ends their career at 100% of their tenure completed. And so we're going to use variation within that time frame. It is not endogenous, whether you are at 0 or at 100% or at 50%, everybody is. Now, that's not quite the analysis I would ideally love to do. I do think that guys who only stay for 2 years maybe never get fully attached, and guys who stay for 10 years might get more attached to their firm and employees. But in order to have an instrument, I'm saying, fine, I'm putting them all together. I'm asking whether within however many years you have, does your propensity to lay off people decline? Whether that's 2 years, 10 years, or 25 years. So first stage, regress actual tenure on, let's call it tenure proportion. You see the formula up here. And then use that predicted instrumented tenure in the second stage. And you find, in fact, very strong, significantly negative results. So within whatever tenure you will have, within your tenure, within each CEO's tenure, we see, on average, a significant declines in the propensity to let people go. We had that already. Here we go. Now, I said before that it's not my ideal instrument. I would love to still be able to distinguish between 2-year tenure CEOs and 20-year tenure CEOs. I don't have an instrument for it. But let me just show you how the plots look like in terms of layoff propensity. If you take short tenure CEOs, up to 5 years, that's the firm line, the solid line. Medium tenure CEOs, the dark dashed line, up to 10 years, and I take long tenure CEOs, everybody above, you do actually see that they're all on a similar path of declining layoff propensity. So this is not instrumented, but this is comforting. However long your tenure is, even with instrument, your layoff propensity is declining, and it's declining more when you're CEO for longer. Here, however, we don't have an instrument. Many robustness checks, which I'm not going to click on in light of the limited time, but just to know that you can, as I said, can drop first years, you can have different layoff thresholds, lots of additional controls in terms of marginal value of labor and capital. The results, by the way, hold only for CEOs, not for CFOs, so that I think was a nice placebo. And we have a couple of additional results, actually, which I will skip here, and just kind of go to those predictions 3 and 4, which say this friction in letting people go when economic business conditions say you should let people go are predicted to be higher when it's particularly painful for the employee, because that gives the CEO greater disutility, and they should be higher when it's particularly hard to witness for the CEO, because it's maybe a person like him or a person nearby. Okay, let's start with the employees. So here's the result of layoffs during recessions. In blue, I have distress layoffs, and in dark blue, light blue, distress layoffs, dark blue, non-distress layoffs. You do see there's kind of a steeper decline and a larger effect for CEOs to let people go during the stress periods. So in recessions, our interpretation is in recessions, the disutility of being fired, not having a job, goes up. And in fact, CEOs who are long tenured and attached to their employees are particularly reluctant to let them go compared to CEOs who just entered the firm. Second, layoffs during the holiday season. I mean, you can actually find a lot of quotes in the Hallock paper with who interviewed the 2,000 senior managers about no one wanting to do it at Christmas. It's not appropriate to lay off people around holidays. We don't want to do it in December for emotional reasons, not for financial reasons. And indeed, if you put on the left-hand side, instead of layoff propensity, you put December layoff propensity, or you can take November, December, like taking Thanksgiving in if you want, then you do see again a significant decline over CEO's tenure as they're getting more attached to implement a December layoff, whether it's the raw bin scatter plot or the residualized one. And you can actually, condition it on this being a year where you have to let people go. There will be a layoff in that year. Do you do it in December? So that's the next graph. The conditional on layoff, do you do a layoff during the holiday season? And again, that propensity is significantly declining and the effects continue to be large. For example, 23.8, almost 24% relative to a baseline of 13%. Okay, next result. So this were results on CEOs who are attached to their firm, having a lot of resistance towards hiring employees when it's maybe particularly hard on them. Now, how about hard on the CEO because he or she has to witness the layoff? Previous papers have shown that the inclination to let people go at the headquarters seems to be particularly low. So let's kind of see whether that interacts with our tenure results. So here I'm plotting the US map where the green triangles are headquarters, dark blue squares are layoffs that are not in headquarters. See here, and then the light blue circles are headquarter layoffs. And you see the distances in the red lines. Okay, so if I kind of redo my previous analysis with all the controls, all the fixed effects, and on the left-hand side, instead of layoff, I put it's a layoff in the headquarter state or even in the city where the headquarter is, I replicate the previous results, a significantly negative effect, if anything, more statistically significant. I can then condition it on actually being a layoff year. So it's a year where the firm has to let somebody go. Are they particularly unwilling to do that in the city where they also sit in their headquarters? And the answer is yes. The effect's quite sizable and still 5% significant. Where I don't get significance is if I condition on this firm being in a year where they have to let people go, they will do a layoff. And that layoff will also be in the headquarter state. And then asking, is it particularly unlikely to happen in the headquarter city? I get a high coefficient. I don't get significance. My sample is down from 35,000 to 1,400. So I think we're just running out of power there. But just kind of wanted to share that result as well. Now, I think the most interesting result for me is actually the social proximity result. So these kind of empathy results have been found to be stronger when it affects somebody who's kind of in my in-group, who looks similar to me, in whom I can see myself. So given that almost all of the CEOs are white-collar workers from the beginning, some have a little bit of blue-collar background, but we still haven't found somebody who really worked their way up from being the mechanic in putting the cars together to becoming CEOs in our sample. More people who, interned earlier in their life, maybe as a mechanic and so on. So I think for practical purposes, we can for now think about all of them as white collar, but we're still searching for blue collars. And in that case, they should be more reluctant to let the white collars go. So what we did is we classified layoffs as white collar, blue collar, using, for white collar, that it was a layoff in an office job, blue and actually pink collar, so sales, when words like factory, plant, store, retail were used. And we double checked with a census data at the city level that say if it's a blue collar layoffs, then in fact it's a city like Detroit where there are lots of blue collar jobs available. Here are the results. So first, again, substitute the left-hand side layoff simply with white-collar layoff, redo your baseline analysis and replicate it. Yes, it holds up, it's highly significant. And then you can even condition on it being a layoff year. And again, you find the effect is even larger. So conditional on having to let some people go, you're really reluctant to let the white-collar people go. Here's the visualization. So here, again, a one standard deviation effect in terms of a tenure means a reduction of more than 20% in layoff propensity, in this case, white collar layoff propensity. Okay, I'm almost out of time. Just super briefly, as I said earlier, like we feel to complete the model, we should be able to find where the CEOs take the money from to keep all these people employed. So reduced profits is one prediction. It's hard to measure given everything else in the data. One thing we did is we regressed R&D expenditure, which seems to be a somewhat more flexible form of investment on CEO tenure, industry distress, tenure, industry interaction. Highly tenured CEOs, if anything, actually spend more on R&D. However, if they're hit with a distress shock and, in parentheses, are trying to avoid letting people go, then they significantly reduce how much they're spending on R&D. So inter-quarter increase in tenure leads to a 0.3 decrease in R&D rate, percent decrease in R&D rate, which, these are all small numbers, but it's measurable within the inter-quarter range of 0.017 and 0.101 in terms of R&D rate. So R&D divided by like assets. Okay, last result, sorry, is that natural question would be to what extent can we detect heterogeneity in CEO empathy? Like some are empathetic people, some are the psychopaths who don't have any problem letting people go. We thought a lot about proxies. So the usual proxies, are they charitable givers and so on. It doesn't quite fit because there has to be towards the employee, and plus a lot of them are confounded. There are lots of reasons why you give to charity to gain social status, etc. So the closest idea we have so far is that Steve Kaplan and Sørensen with various co-authors have kind of looked a lot at CEO personal assessment data, and they've kind of established that overconfidence and empathy are primary distinguishing characteristics, where overconfidence, proxied by this longholder measure I've used in my previous work on overconfidence, is kind of the flip side of empathy. So I have less listening skills, I'm less committed to my employees if my proxy for longholder is equal to 1. So here's the last table. We don't have the data complete yet, but so in our full sample, usual result, layoff probability declines if I'm a longer tenured CEO. In my sample for which I have the empathy over confidence proxy, so it's this longholder measure of not exercising options, and the flip side of that is the empathy measure. I don't replicate significantly our main result. I have a two-thirds of the sample. I hope I can still get this up to being the full sample. However, if I interact tenure with empathy and overconfidence, you see that the results are driven by the CEOs who score high on empathy and not by the overconfident CEOs. The difference is not significant, but maybe if we can complete the sample, we might get there. All right, I'll wrap up. So we are presenting new evidence and interpretations of frictions and layoff decisions. There's a personal cost for CEOs of hiring. The implication is, frictions are not entirely due to rational career concern, maximizing your future income and career. There seems to be something else going on. And we propose we might want to call that empathy or managerial prosociality, given that it seems to be particularly strong among CEOs who have been attached to their firms for a while, and they exhibit it particularly strongly when they are socially or geographically close to their employees, or if the employees are particularly suffering from a firing decision. If you believe our results, I think they have lots of neat implications for future research about financial decisions in times of crisis, the trade of investment versus labor, governance, not just CEOs stealing money, but if you're a cold-blooded financial investor, you might not like what they're doing with not letting people go. And with selection, who wants to be a CEO who has to make these type of decisions? And I'll stop here. Thank you very much.